I'm Greg Bangs of Booz Allen Hamilton. We're proud to be a founding sponsor of the Aspen Ideas Festival, which was first held some 10 years ago. Now, we're celebrating a special milestone of our own. This is our firm's 100th anniversary, as this banner up here indicates. Good to have a good prop there. So I'd like to salute the power of 10, the 10th anniversary of the Aspen Ideas Festival, and our own 100th. Now, one housekeeping note up front. I know that a lot of you may be interested in what's happening in soccer, so if we can turn down the cell phones and turn down the iPhones. Kevin's promised to give us an occasional update after 1 o'clock, which is great. And speaking of Kevin, he is our moderator, Kevin Delaney. He's editor-in-chief and co-president of Quartz, Atlantic Media's global business news site. As a reporter at the Wall Street Journal for a decade, covering companies such as Google and Twitter, he became convinced that newspapers could do more to help good journalism thrive in the digital age. He became managing editor of WSJ.com, where he led efforts that expanded online readership and championed prize-winning innovative journalism. We look forward to him moderating this panel. Kevin?
Thank you, Greg. Thanks very much. On behalf of the panel, I want to express our gratitude for the seriousness of your interest and commitment to this important topic. As Mark said, you've learned that the most important topics generally don't get the most attention. Is that the? And I have committed to the game starts at 2. Along with time signals, I'm getting score updates. So I'll be happy to provide any of those. So the topic today, as Greg said, is we're going to focus this session on cyber attacks on corporations, cyber espionage, looking at the business world. There's obviously a lot of political and global dimensions of that, but this is a really good group to look at it. I'm going to start, I'll introduce the panelists. I'm going to start with Mike McConnell. He's the former vice chairman of Booz Allen Hamilton. Today is his first day as a retiree. Is that right? Thank you for joining us. Mike pointed out to me earlier that he's retired 4 or 5 times before, so there's no guarantee. This may be fleeting, and you may be a select audience that sees him retired. Mike, he's also served as the U.S. Director of National Intelligence from 2007 to 2009. Clearly a critical moment for thinking about for the U.S. upgrading its capabilities for cybersecurity and cyber intelligence. Sitting next to Mike is Melody Hildebrandt. She's the global head of cybersecurity for Palantir and works with corporate clients. Palantir has data integration analysis software. Basically, they're working with companies to detect cybersecurity issues and try and figure out how to resolve them. Sitting next to me is Mark Penn. He is the Executive Vice President and Chief Strategy Officer at Microsoft. He's also worked as a consultant with a number of other companies that have faced cybersecurity issues in past years. So we're going to dive right in. We're going to first start by talking about the problem and eventually get to the how companies can deal with this and governments and other actors can play. Before we start, just one small bit of data which sets the context. I think a lot of us know that data breaches and corporate cybersecurity issues and problems are actually hitting home. The one that has been in the headlines over the past year has been the Target data breach, where a group of East European hackers were able to get access to probably most of our personal data as part of that. There's an estimate just a week or two ago from CSIS in Washington, the think tank, that the U.S. lost $100 billion, or about 0.6% of our GDP, to the impact of corporate cyber espionage. That's intellectual property that was lost and things like that. So I'm going to start, Mike, by going to you. We did a panel with Tim Pawlenty a year ago where we were talking about some of these issues. I'm going to start by asking you, over that past 12 years, what has changed? What have we learned about the state of cyber issues that corporations are facing?
Kevin, let me start by saying, as a retiring consultant, you learn in the consulting business that culture is always successful in trumping strategy. And I've learned today that soccer trumps cybersecurity. So we'll see where this goes. Over the past 12 months, it's gotten worse, and it will continue to get worse. Let me just frame it by saying all nations in the world that have a sophisticated cyber capability, except 5, engage in state-sponsored cyber economic espionage. The most prolific is China. Their targets are corporate America. We are an innovative country, and virtually every corporation of any significance has been penetrated by the Chinese for remote command and control, not for the purpose of degradation or contamination, but for the purpose of extracting information that would give them competitive advantage. That's a policy that was decided upon in China in the mid-'80s. It's still in effect. It's going more and more. What we're seeing in the press is the proliferation of criminal acts where someone's after something of value. They want credit cards so they can sell them on the black market or something like that. The larger threat is nation-state sponsored economic espionage. The United States is losing its intellectual property, intellectual capital at the terabit level on a daily basis.
And you said that virtually every U.S. corporation of any size has been penetrated by such actors. Is that right?
Both Booz Allen and Palantir do this sort of service to corporate America. We've examined computer systems for large corporations, for the government, for the Congress. We have never examined a large computer system that was not penetrated by the Chinese for remote access. So from China, reach into the system and extract whatever they choose to download for whatever their purpose might be.
Melody, what's your assessment of the state of things?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think what we've seen is that there's been quite a bit of investment and advancement in a variety of technology solutions that do interesting things. So we're excited by application whitelisting, micro-virtualization, like a lot of innovations that are happening on the detection front. But we have the same experience in that we see all organizations actually are breached and have been breached. And it's really about kind of reducing the time to action from detection of the breach to recognizing there's a problem and containing it. And that's where kind of a lot of the gaps are actually in current capability. And actually, if you can close the gap to when you detect something's gone wrong and you can close that, that's actually in many ways winning.
So your assumption is that you've been breached, you have been subject to an attack, you just have to find out as quickly as possible.
Kevin, the way I summarize it when I'm speaking to a group like this, there are 2 kinds of corporations: those that have been breached and know it, and those that have been breached and do not know it.
Yeah. Mark, Microsoft works with a lot of these companies and actually writes some of the software that is that's targeted, or in some cases by the attackers. What's your take on the state of affairs?
I think obviously this is a major and growing and really global concern. I think you've seen that we have a cyber crimes unit that has been particularly active, really at all levels. I think you've seen us announce policies for increased encryption of people using our services. And in fact, we put out a blog today announcing the encryption on Outlook.com. I think you've seen us kind of look at the need to be transparent, the need to be private, and the need to be fully secure as 3 kind of key principles, right? That it's important for both people and organizations, I think, to follow. I think that the issue, I think, has become more complex as you pointed out, I worked in things with Sony or Express Scripts over the years when I was a consultant before at Microsoft. And so you've seen this go from something that even almost the public regarded as a joke. Wow, there's some kid somewhere hacking into a corporate computer, to now real fears about major and significant governments and everything in between. And at stake, everything from credit cards to the functioning of our energy and power systems. And then I also think you've seen here, government action, A, as it relates to intelligence, and B, as it relates to economic enterprise. And those are 2 very, different situations, and they're both growing, I think, as importance. Who and how are we going to deal with state-sponsored incidents of this, and how is the international community going to essentially develop a new series of norms? I think that there are a huge number of open questions here all around.
We'll get to some of those. Is your sense, like Mike's, that the biggest issue is state-sponsored economic espionage as opposed to hackers trolling for credit card swipes at retailers.
Well, you know, the biggest issue is always the one that's in the news.
Yeah.
So I don't think we know what the biggest issue is. I think part of what Mike said is that part of the problem is unknown. But I think that if you look at the biggest new development, it certainly is this specter of state-sponsored hacking for both of those reasons. One that I think was probably always happening, and two that I think is newly emerging for a variety of reasons.
What's the second one that's newly
The second
emerging?
one would really be for economic purposes.
Okay.
For economic, competitive, industrial, espionage, or monkey wrench purposes, right? To have that state sponsors is quite different than state sponsoring intelligence or potential cyber warfare efforts that were probably really expected all along.
Melanie, I want to talk a little bit more specifically before we delve into some of the issues about what this looks like, what a cyber attack or cyber penetration of a company looks like. And Melody, you've been in the war room of some big banks, I think, during some of these incidents. Can you tell us more about what it looks from that perspective? What it looks like from that perspective?
Sure. I think the example here might be even like looking at the distributed denial of service attacks that happened against a variety of financial institutions. And obviously these war rooms are pretty hectic. And looking at, say, a large financial institution that in many ways has modeled its war room after a top-tier defense industrial complex war room. So it's really kind of what you see in television, you imagine actually some of that's there. And the challenge there is really like if you're responding to a threat, and in this case, websites are down for your customers to actually be able to access their online banking. How do you, one, get your website back up fast? And second, which is a very related analytic question, is like who is actually behind this? And that type of analytics is actually, we saw to be quite difficult. It requires kind of the analysis of not only all your scale network logs, which in itself is very difficult to manage, but also all this unstructured data that might be presented, say, through social media, where in this case, it emerged pretty quickly. This was the Iranians, and they were bragging in many ways kind of on social media about what was happening. And what we saw in that environment was that what actually ended up being in many ways a game changer was this emergence of collaboration. And so it's kind of shocking to be in one bank's war room, and suddenly you have emails coming in from all their fiercest competitors, providing them intelligence to help them respond to the incident. In this case, it was like the hackers essentially had Wikipedia top US banks by assets and were going down in a list. It was pretty predictable what was happening. And the intelligence that was provided by peer institutions, in this case, chief information security officers emailing spreadsheets of known malicious IP addresses to their top competitor to help them respond, kind of set the groundwork for kind of what then became much more robust investment in information sharing. But that integration of data to actually have situational awareness on what's happening and respond it was quite complex.
So, and this was the 2012, early 2013 Iranian attacks on banks. Why, just not to go too deep technically, but why is it so hard to figure out where these attacks are originating, and what do you actually do when you're under fire? What tools do you have?
So in this case, fundamentally now you can kind of buy your way out of the problem of DDoS through redirection of traffic. In this case, there was relatively sophisticated redirection so that the Iranians essentially had built a network of people that they had kind of recruited to then be essentially pummeling the sites of these banks and bring them down. So it actually was fairly globally distributed. Yeah. And the question really is like, what's normal traffic? So you actually want to let your customer traffic through versus what is essentially this traffic that's being centrally managed by someone who's seeking to disrupt your service. And actually distinguishing between those two types of traffic can be a challenge, or you can kind of pay for redirection, which was extraordinarily expensive, which is one interesting observation on this is that the U.S. banks were forced to spend tens of millions, $100 million responding to these DDoS incidents. Many of them, their perspective is essentially this was a tax that they were forced to bear based on U.S. government policies, and them as like the prominent financial institutions were forced to bear the heat on this, and they had to absorb the costs, which were quite significant, both analytically and the technology investments they had to make.
So basically they had all this traffic coming at their websites that was taking their websites down, and they had to pay someone to absorb the traffic and try and filter out the stuff that was legitimate customers.
Exactly.
And that the cost of that is tens of millions of dollars.
Kevin,
Yeah.
it may be useful just to explain a little bit about what is a distributed denial of service attack. And by that, a relatively small group of people with some computer assets can infect servers of the telecommunications infrastructure and then literally cause gigabytes, billions of bytes per second. In the case of the Iranians, it went up to 80 gigs per second. The interesting part of the debate is the banks reacted, and as Melanie said, the big effort was to shunt the traffic that was illegitimate to route it to ground and then deal with the legitimate traffic. The interesting part of the debate is the banking community turned to the U.S. government and said, we're being attacked by a nation state. What are you going to do about it? And the response was, well, we think you're doing okay, so we're not going to do anything about it. That's an interesting policy question for the nation. A nation state is attacking the banking community. Now, fortunately for us, they chose the top tier banks who could spend the $100 million and cope with it. What if they'd taken a second tier or third tier bank? The bank would have been overwhelmed. And as everyone knows, banking is based on confidence. If a bank goes down, it impacts the entire banking industry. And I think of, and most people do, the banking or financial services as a part of our critical infrastructure. So it risks strategic damage if it had been unchecked.
So for a person who's not involved in this, it seems strange that the U.S. government, which is aware of what's going on, sees the state actor, wouldn't activate on behalf of its financial system in such a circumstance. What are the rules or practices that are preventing the U.S. government from getting involved?
That's just the question. Is it an act of war? Is it a hostile act? So the debate internally was, so long as U.S. industry can cope, then we will not necessarily react in a significant way. The United States is the best at information warfare probably in the world. There's some top tier. On a scale of 1 to 10, I would say the United States is a 10. So is Russia. So is the United Kingdom. Others maybe 9, 9.5. The Israelis, the French, Chinese maybe an 8 or so. So we have the ability to do that. We could have shut it down. We could have gone to the site and caused it to shut down. But the policy decision was, damage is not severe enough. We're not going to take that step. So the policy debate today is, what are the rules? And this whole emerging digital technology and our digital dependence has not been debated or argued, and that we have a framework to deal with it in a more constructive way.
So we're gonna come back to that question in a minute. You talked about China. What are the other principal offenders in the group of locations where people are attacking the U.S.?
For nation-state economic espionage, we want to get research and development or innovation ideas or bid strategies or whatever. Literally every nation-state engages in that with the exception of the United States, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand.
So U.S. policy is that we do not engage in economic espionage.
That's correct.
On behalf of our industry.
That's correct.
The Chinese do not believe that that's
absolutely not.
True.
We engage in very vigorous espionage for legitimate intelligence targets, like how fast do the missiles fly, or how many nuclear weapons, or what kind of submarines, or whatever that question may be, but not for economic reasons.
Yeah, Melanie, do you want to add the?
I say to your initial question, kind of about who's behind this. I think by volume, China is the biggest perpetrator. There are countries that are better, So as the Admiral mentioned, like France, Israel, Russia. These are our institutions that actually have greater capability and actually could be more damaging, and when they actually try to do these things.
So China's responsible for about 80% of the current ebb and flow of economic espionage because they're so prolific. They have 100,000 on the military side of people who do this, and they had about a similar number on the civilian side. So it's very, very extensive.
And there's a pretty big milestone I guess it was in May, when the Department of Justice indicted 5 members of the Chinese military, 5 military officers on charges of cyber espionage. Is that meaningful in any way?
I think it was a policy statement more than anything else. Effectively, they're not going to come to the United States. We're not going to arrest them. We're not going to indict them, and certainly not going to convict them. But it stated very clearly to China, As we've said at the assistant secretary level, the deputy secretary level, the secretary level, and the presidential level, we know you're doing it, and we want you to stop. Their answer is, we're not doing it. So this is just another way to drive that message home.
I thought it was also interesting because the companies were actually public. So Alcoa, like the other
US
victims
Steel,
in this U.S.
Westinghouse,
Steel, were
yeah.
actually named, whereas in the general approach now is that companies are fused to, or are very hesitant to actually admit that they're breached due to liability and a variety of other concerns. So in this way, it was interesting that they actually were named, and actually what the impact was to their business was very publicly announced. So I think the transparency around that decision was also interesting, even if we won't see an immediate impact.
When a public corporation has been breached, there's a very serious argument, usually involving a general counsel. Is this material? What do the regulators say? And this was a debate.
Does it require SEC disclosure?
And there's no incentive for a company to report the information. So we have a whole set of issues to deal with in that space also.
But again, you're not, how are you going to deal with international norms here?
Yeah.
And how have we dealt with all sorts of international behaviors in the economic sphere? Usually effectively, until we get the right kind of treaties in place to deal with it, we have a situation that's not fundamentally under control.
Yeah.
And so will this action work? I'm going to comment one way or the other, but the need here is not for one country to start necessarily indicting the officials of other countries. The need here is for countries to get together and realize, as they have done on all weapons of mass destruction, and I think we're getting to the point where cyber warfare could mass destroy societies by laying waste to financial, energy, and other systems. And so what kind of agreements are we going to come to that will take this off the table when we realize that the threats are too great and we have to establish international norms for technology in order for everybody to benefit? I think that's where this thing has to come out.
Is there a WTO or other organizations that are logical home for this?
I think there are some. I don't think that whether we found the right one or not, I think that's an open question too.
So far, two nations have taken it to the United Nations and put proposals on the table. Those two nations are Russia and China. The reason they are advocates is they want to control content to their own populations. So the United States has said no. Our view of the internet, it should be open to the free flow of ideas and for support trade and commerce. So far there hasn't been a galvanizing set of functions. I agree entirely with Mark. The way we're going to deal with this over time is there has to be international agreement. The one thing that America is going to wake up in a few years and find out is that China is the largest economy in the world. So it seems to me we ought to be dealing with this issue now as vigorously as we could.
So we talked at a high level about how there's state-sponsored economic espionage. Are there specific examples that we can talk about? I know that there are certain confidentiality restrictions about some of the work that you've all done with clients, but anything that's public or any specific example we could talk through?
Probably the one that's most public is most corporations now tend to use products provided by RSA, a security company. They make tokens. So think of it as multi-factor authentication. So when you use your laptop, you log on with a password. Well, if you want to add more complexity to that, you make it two-factor. And one of the things that RSA offered was a token where the number on the token would change every minute.
Yeah.
Now, if you are attacking a large corporation, you want to get on the inside, if you had the root key for how those numbers change, that would be very beneficial. So what the Chinese did was they broke into RSA and successfully wormed their way to the inside, so they actually downloaded the root keys. So they could compromise all the tokens that protected the largest corporations in the country.
It sort of gets to a fundamental question. So we're gonna focus in a few minutes on what the specific solutions are, the specific outcomes. We're actually gonna have a little bit of time for questions also. So if anybody is reacting to anything here, please jot it down and we'll come back to you. But the fundamental question that raises on some level is, why don't we just build more secure computers? Microsoft has a lot of researchers and developers. Isn't there a technology solution, or can't there be a technology solution to the Chinese infiltrating the Fortune 500 countries?
Look, I think you look at the history of anything that's required security,
Yeah.
whether it was banks that had to build the first vaults, it's always at the end of the day an arms race. So kind of if you look at the frontiers of this, I think one of the big questions is who's going to hold the security keys? Are they going to continue to be held by the technology provider, or more and more customers going to hold the security keys themselves, and then they'll have more responsibility. It does mean that if governments come knocking, that they'll have to go there, and we'll be able to say, look, the security keys and this encrypted information is with the customer. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a kind of major kind of a growing trend. Although there are limits to the ability to do that as you analyze, large data sets. And so I think you're saying technology continues to move forward. Then I also think, there's a legal frontier on this. If you take a look at what we did, in the last couple of days, one of the big problems are dynamic DNS services, right, that serve really as an entry point for malware. And so we've sued one of the companies for negligence. So we have to look at kind of those areas that are really serving as the open areas for letting malware in on a mass scale, and say that more and more companies have to be responsible for that directly. Mm-hmm. And so the whole legal system, I think, is important, and the international framework. So this is not going to be technology alone. People are going to have to guard their own fences, from the individual through to big corporations. They're going to deploy, advanced technical solutions that will continue to evolve. The legal system on this will evolve, and the international system on this will evolve.
Melody, just on the technology question to follow up, why don't we just have more secure computers, networks?
Yeah, I think you're dealing with a fundamentally adaptive adversary, and Admiral knows the numbers better than I do. But in terms of looking at the numbers of the Chinese military that are actively working on exploiting vulnerabilities in current systems, and the American side of that, it's a question in many ways of human talent and innovation in this area, and the dedication of resources against it. So there are, I think, a lot of evolutions that are happening now that are improving our defenses. So previous models that have shown to fail, like building big firewalls around your network and thinking that you can stop traffic that way, that has failed. You're seeing movement like more endpoint monitoring, which is a smart move, and we're seeing actually is decreasing the number of attacks in some ways. But the Chinese and the other actors are going to adapt and continue to exploit the latest vulnerability that is presented. So it's really about continuing to put the best human talent kind of against that problem.
Are there any specific technologies that you mentioned a few, I think, that are most promising or most effective in terms of protecting companies? Yeah,
think about just looking at some of how the biggest breaches have happened, looking at things like spear phishing. So all the cases in the U.S. Department of Justice indictment mention spear phishing. So in this case, this is when an employee has received an email that is disguised to look like one of his colleagues' emails. It looks innocuous. He clicks on a link that installs malware on his machine, and he's compromised. Alternatively, you have spear phishing that might send you to some link on the internet that also can be a vector to compromise your machine. This is where we're seeing, in many ways, employees being the weakest link in security. So we're excited by some of the companies like Bromium that are doing interesting micro virtualization, essentially being able to contain threats within the browser. Given that is a vector through which we're seeing the threats deployed currently. And so I think that's an interesting innovation that's moving similarly from network level to looking more endpoint level, given that's often kind of where the initial infiltration happens.
Mm-hmm. Mike? Yeah,
what I would mention, most everyone here has got a device of some sort, either a cell phone or a laptop or something, and I would say 95% of those were manufactured in China. Now, the intellectual capital that created them more than likely came from the United States, but the supply chain of coming from China to here, that's a vulnerability. To use Mark's example of we built banks with vaults to protect something valuable, I'd say we're in the early, comparing this to the cyber situation, we're in the early stages of early banking when they say maybe we should create a vault. Yeah. This is not just a technology issue. That I believe we have the technology, we can create the technology we need. It will involve culture change, it will involve policy and operations, it'll have a legal framework. So this is an addressable problem, but the pain level hasn't been sufficient yet to cause us to embrace it in a robust way. It is secure software, it's secure hardware, it's your human talent behavior and how you deal with it. So there are a lot of solutions, but we haven't come together on it yet.
So let's focus now, let's turn to some of the things that are not being done today, but that can be done. Do you want to, Mike, what do you think are the most critical policy or corporate actions for addressing the threat that you've all been talking about?
Well, all the incentives for the past number of years for corporations that are penetrated is to withhold the information, not to share it because it may be reputational damage or whatever the issue might be, material for the SEC or whatever. So all the incentives are in the wrong direction. My view is that for us to address this in a robust way, we have to share information. We have to share it across industries, across sectors, and across the various private sector components. Also, the U.S. government and intelligence capability, which is where I come from, we have a lot of information. It's all classified. Why isn't my community forced to provide that information to corporate America? Mm-hmm. A lot of this malware, how to identify what's bad and exclude it, that information is available. So in my view, until we have a legal framework that encourages and incentivizes the private sector to exchange information among themselves and with the government, and the force of law to cause the government to share sensitive information in the corporate sector, and then incentives for the private sector to engage in this activity. An example, if you share the information and you meet some standard of due care, and we're arguing about what that might be right now, the National Institute of Standards and Technology just published a framework that it may become that or something like that. If the private corporation met that standard of due care, why shouldn't they have liability protection against frivolous suits if there's been a breach? Mm-hmm. So in my view, that's the kind of dialogue we're going to have. There are a couple of bills on the Hill today. One's passed the House already. One's being debated in the Senate. It addresses many of these issues. I suspect neither one of them will get to the President's desk. Last year there were 14 bills and amendments. They all failed. This year there are 2 that are in contention, and likely they will fail also.
Because of it's the online privacy concerns related to...
They're the privacy debate about, and that sort of draws attention away from it. Yeah. There's also not the consensus or the forcing function to cause us to come together to agree to this legislation.
Melody, what on your list of things that companies and policymakers can do, what's the top few?
Yeah, I fully agree with the need for information sharing. I think we're probably seeing that that's a little further out. And so there's actions that smart organizations are taking currently. So we're seeing industry level collaboration groups that are really robust. And it's pretty interesting looking like the top 5 fiercest competitors in a given industry actually banding together around a shared threat. And actually having actionable information like that they're sharing with their partners on this problem. So we're seeing a lot of movement in that direction, and this is exciting because one, it actually provides the context that allows an organization to respond to a threat in a better way, but also it's really the only feasible way outside of receiving intelligence from the government to actually know about a targeted attack. Like that's not going to come from any run-of-the-mill technology solution that's been deployed, but knowing that your fiercest competitor, the number 2 bank or the number 1 bank, have been targeted in this way, that actually can be intelligence around targeted attacks. So I think we're seeing financial services is obviously most sophisticated in this area, but we're seeing similar networks crop up in retail banking and insurance and in other industries that potentially are less sophisticated in this way and are willing to actually implement these sharing protocols with each other.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, when we say information sharing, we're talking about sharing large volumes of information at network speed, and of course that means the speed of light. So it's not send an email or make a phone call. Yeah. This is sharing malware signatures, vulnerability data, and doing it in a very robust, comprehensive way. And when the attackers share information and compare notes, but the defenders do not. So that's where we have to get to.
And I was going to say, having before Microsoft worked in a number of companies that were not expecting attacks to occur and not expecting large swaths of customer information to be stolen. In those instances, not particularly by governments. We've been focusing so much on governments, but there's just cybercrime that is cybercrime too. Yeah. And the level of preparedness for that I think Melanie's right. The financial community is probably absolutely at the highest level of everyday readiness. But a typical company, whether it's a retailer that's maintaining several million credit cards and customers, may not really be thinking that those are going to be stolen overnight. We're just beginning to, I think, basically put on computer our medical records and the crime scenarios related to prescription medical data are just phenomenal, right? In terms of what people can do once they get not just your credit card, but your prescription record, your disease record. I mean, we're really going to come up on new problems where big data has never before held the kind of information on citizens that has been held. So we're going to need to think about how we react, how we deal with those crimes, and those will often be blackmail. Those will often be completely different situations that no one's expected, where the information's ransomed, right? And the first time you'll know that the information's been stolen is when you get the ransom note. And so I think you've got to look at these problems, and as I said before, first it's got to begin with a real awareness, readiness, contingency planning for companies. We're seeing more of that. But I think what typically happens, it's only when something happens related to you or your industry that you really get onto it to the level of full resource awareness. And at the same time, as I think we've hit before, the legal system really is developing in some odd ways that really needs to be, I think, settled in favor of the ability to keep data confidential in the right circumstances.
Yeah, and so one of the solutions, it seems, is for greater data sharing between the government, intelligence agencies, and private companies back and forth. This is an area where the data sharing, voluntary or involuntary, is a hot button issue for online privacy rights, and there are a bunch of other considerations. Microsoft, I think you mentioned, spends a fair amount of its legal resources resisting sharing consumer data.
Well, I think we're clear that there are no backdoors. There will be no backdoors.
Yeah.
And that we've been pressing for clear definition of those instances where data can and cannot be accessed by warrant. Right now, there's a case in New York, and so the question is, can the U.S. government access someone's email that's held in Ireland? And what will happen if precedents aren't set that a mere warrant can't be used in order to access that without going through proper international channels?
Yeah.
And what the reciprocal situation will be back and forth. We think the rules of the road have to be defined so that people can have confidence that their information is confidential from government service, and know when it is and how that service has to occur. And I think that we believe that that's an example of the right kind of case where authority could be exceeded.
And it's complicated because the internet is global, and a lot of these actors might be U.S. actors, but in fact have their servers elsewhere, and that sort of thing.
But we still live in a sovereign nation world.
Yeah. Do you have a view on that, Mike?
I do. I think actually it's a broader question, and it's going to be a social issue we're going to have to deal with, because the other side of this is if you look at the large corporations who provide free email service, they know more about us than we often know about ourselves. Mm-hmm. Let me use an example for you. When I went back into government, the security folks came to visit with me, and they said, we're going to have to provide you with security detail. I said, no, I'm a pretty low profile guy. I don't think I'll need that. And he said, well, you don't understand. We're engaged in counterterrorism. There are people who would love to make a very high profile hit on you. Let me show you something. Opened up a laptop, and within 5 minutes with just my name, they showed me every property that I own, satellite photography, approach lanes, police response times. I mean, it was incredible what they could show of potential vulnerability for me. And it's caused me to start thinking about this. It's amazing today what the providers of these services know about us as individuals. And so that's a question we're going to have to deal with at some time. Is that something we want to continue? The internet has been effective largely because it's a surveillance network.
Yeah.
If you provide these free services, you get to know the behavior of humans, and you can target them for advertising or whatever. Well, we're going to get to the point of predictive analytics so that you can predict human behavior.
Yeah.
Now that, to me, is a very important question. It hasn't been subject to much debate at all about how do we adjust to that going forward.
So we're going to take questions in a minute. I want to ask a related question before we do, which is the scenario that you're all talking about involves some of the country's greatest business minds spending some portion of their time focusing on issues of defense, essentially. So corporate cyber defense. Is there a cost to that, or is that in terms of the performance of businesses, in terms of the ability of executives to make decisions that are potentially more?
There's cost for not doing it. Let me use Target as my example.
Yeah.
As everyone, I'm sure you're aware, Target was breached by criminals. 40 million credit card were downloaded. Also, 70 million personally identifiable information sets of data were downloaded. That's a third of our population. Now, so far, the CEO's been fired. A group has recommended that 7 members of the 10 members of the board of directors be fired. They're going to be tested in court with a class action suit. So it's essential that, in my view, boards of directors and CEOs, C-suites start to think about this problem, because it's going to become increasingly a problem. It's going to be their problem. Did they have a standard of due care to address this set of issues? And if not, they're going to be held not only a fiduciary responsibility, they're going to be held personally liable.
Yeah, it's interesting to think. I think this event, really thinking about the future. So if you play through some of the more pernicious economic effects, I think this is interesting. So you have, if you're a CEO, what's the one thing that could happen overnight that essentially you have no power or control over that will cost you your job? So when a data breach costs you your job, I think this kind of fundamentally can shift kind of business priorities in a way. So you think about if you're a CEO and this is what's keeping you up at night, as like the panel discussed last year, this fundamentally makes you think defensively rather than offensively. And I think it's interesting to kind of play through a thought exercise, like what does this mean for American innovation moving forward, when CEOs are focused on being on the defense, and that's what they're mainly concerned about, rather than how they can move the business and how they can innovate.
I just think there's no functioning technology network without the right balance of security, privacy, and transparency that we pay for. There's no question that we have to do it.
So we're going to take questions now. So I'd ask that you raise your hands, and when you, it's a small room, but if you could stand up when you ask the question, that would be great. We have a microphone that's going to make its way down and we have time for, I think, all of your questions. So we'll just start. The first person we can get to.
My name's Don Spiro. I wonder if you could address a little bit cyber warfare, which I think of as attacking our systems to bring them down, as distinguished from the cyber espionage you were talking about. Number one, is that easier or harder for the Chinese or anyone else than getting in and extracting the IP? Secondly, if they've done that, if they've planted something, do we have ways of knowing that before they push their button so it starts to happen? Or could they be as sophisticated as apparently we were in Stuxnet, so that it just kind of starts to happen and the target doesn't know we've been eating away at their machines?
All nation states that have any military capability today are investing in cyber warfare tools and capability, all. And you use the word, is it more difficult or not for just getting in, for accessing information? The key is getting in. So whether you want to copy the information, degrade the information, whatever, it's getting in. So cyber warfare will be a major portion of any large kinetic engagement between nation states in the future. Now, the United States is very good at this, so are others. And to answer your question about embedding, yes, there have been embeds that are just waiting to be activated, given that there's a reason to do so.
So we have a way of detecting that if it's been embedded.
I mean, it's a timely question. I think we saw just yesterday, if you've seen kind of energetic bear, which is named because the Russians targeted the energy companies. Thus the malware was kind of coined energetic bear, which is a little cute. But in this case, it's an interesting case where the energy companies have essentially been compromised via their suppliers because the Russians were able to embed this malware in their suppliers that was able to move upstream into the energy companies themselves. This was announced just yesterday, the day before. So I think we are seeing, and the reason this is particularly scary is because with Stuxnet, the US and Israel, the best in the class at this, were able to create this kind of malware. We're able to see now potentially evidence that the Russians are able to do so as well. So I think it's a timely question. I think we're seeing like some evidence of the capabilities currently.
Your question about ability to know is mixed. Probably the best ability to know is held in the National Security Agency. It's not likely that that agency is going to be asked to come in the current environment. And there are a number of firms that offer services like this, but it's very mixed. Finding it is very, very difficult. Attribution is very, very difficult. So that's a part of the problem that will have to be addressed in a more vigorous way. Are we as a nation, given the current debate about privacy and government intrusiveness, are we as a nation willing to bring in the best resources of the country inside the United States? Law enforcement is, on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say 3, 4. They started at 0, but they're getting better. They're just not as sophisticated as they'll have to be to do the detection.
So you're saying as a nation we're highly unprepared for this, right?
That's correct. I am saying that.
Great. We'll take another question. Yep.
So this month, The Atlantic ran an article about a federalized internet, and where you'd essentially have a European internet, a U.S. internet, whatnot. Can you comment on the likelihood of that? Do we have the infrastructure to support that? And would that actually help with the security problems that exist?
My own view is it would be detrimental to the interests of global society to have federalized internets. And the power of the internet is what you've experienced. Is from any point on the globe, you can essentially communicate with anyone else in the free flow of ideas and commerce and so on. That's the benefit. So I think it would be the wrong direction to go to make it a federalized by country or region. Now, there are things you can do. The United States military rides the same infrastructure, the same fiber optic pipes that everybody else rides. But they have established what is referred to as .mil as opposed to .com. Everything that flows through that network for them is encrypted. So there are many things you can do to protect information, but from this observer's point of view, federalizing it or breaking it into pieces would not be in the interest of the global society.
So Stuart Baker, I was thinking as you guys were talking that if the mayor of Denver were asked what he's going to do about street crime, and he said, well, first I'm going to encourage pedestrians to share information about where the crimes are occurring, and second I'm going to sue them for negligence if they go to those places, he'd be out of office in 48 hours. So the real question is, what can government do to actually deter this kind of behavior? We've seen indictments of 6 Chinese PLA members. The indictment says that those guys were actually hired by a steel company in China to put together an entire database of stolen information for them. So my question is, what do you think of those indictments, and should the Chinese steel company be indicted too?
My view is the Chinese steel company should be indicted. Deterrence is one of the most difficult things to debate in cyberspace. If one side has missiles and the other side has missiles and you've got mutually assured destruction, deterrence is a pretty real thing. So one side has a military capability and the other, deterrence is understood. Much more nebulous in this space. I think it's achievable, but when I was back in government, we had a whole series of issues to focus on this. The one that is most difficult to get your arms around is how would you achieve deterrence in cyberspace? I think it's doable, but we haven't invested the time and resources to think our way through it just yet.
For technical reasons.
No, it's more will. Yeah. Will, awareness and will. I think if the American public really understands this at the level of potential damage, and then they exhibit the will to address it, I think it would be addressed in a much more comprehensive way.
Shane Harris, Admiral McConnell, good to see you again. I want a question about capabilities. I mean, going back to your old agency, NSA. Admiral Rogers gave an interview to the New York Times a couple of days ago. And of course, he's running NSA and Cyber Command now. And he said that the leaks from Edward Snowden and the damage that they'd done to intelligence gathering capabilities were actually manageable. And that he felt that the NSA would eventually get past this. They would develop new capabilities to do the kind of things that we're talking about now that are so vital to the mission. I'd be curious to get your take on that. I mean, General Alexander described the leaks as the most catastrophic damage that had ever been done to U.S. intelligence capabilities in his view. Rogers is saying something sounds quite different. Where do you come down on the damage to capabilities that have been caused by these leaks?
The damage was significant, and I would agree with this statement that no spy has ever done more damage to us in terms of our global comprehensive capability. One of the things compromised was basically the guidebook. So where are we having success and by what source and method? So if the adversary has that, they can stop spending money in other places and just address the areas that they're being exploited. So I would agree with Alexander's characterization. Now, if I put myself in Mike Rogers' seat, as you know I have occupied before, as the director of NSA, your first responsibility is to be the chief cheerleader. You've got a workforce that's pretty disgruntled right now, pretty upset, sort of depressed. So you've got to say, we will get through this. I think we can. For this audience, just let me capture it this way. For a sophisticated and persistent adversary, there isn't a computer system on the globe that can't be exploited. So if you start with that premise, then I would agree with Rogers. This was significant damage, but if we have the will and the resources and we stay with it, then we'll be able to recover at some point in time.
We do a score check, U.S. game. Anybody have? 0-0. Thank you. Okay. Just
with quantum computing maybe out there in the fringes, does that change the game here?
quantum computing, encryption.
My view is yes. Quantum computing would significantly change the game. Mark mentioned encryption. The way when I mentioned .mil, how the military sends secrets around the world, they encrypt. So if there is some tampering with that information, it's instantly knowable. So what you're after with cybersecurity is data integrity, attribution, non-repudiation, those sort of features. So encryption allows you to do that. Quantum computing, the theory is you could open up encryption literally at network speed. So it is a significant technology that we're investing in, but it hasn't been achieved yet.
I think even some of the slower investments, slower advancements in computing have already opened up a lot of opportunities in this area as well. Organizations that are now, essentially dealing with, 2 years worth of all of their historic data, all of their weblog data. So every action that's any customer's ever taken on their network, or proxy data, any action that any of their employees have ever taken on the internet, retaining all of those logs across 2 years, and actually having those historic records is the only way that organizations, in many ways, can actually detect when is something actually different than before. Is this normal? Is it not normal? I think organizations have really, the technology has improved so that organizations can actually perform that type of analysis, which is reliant on not quite quantum computing, but some of the advances in computing power that are becoming more accessible to a larger portion of corporations.
Dick, could I just say a word about encryption, because it's useful. I've spent part of my life there. It's just useful to convey this as just an idea. When something is encrypted, you can open it, it's scrambled. You can open it back to plain text one of 3 ways. You have the key, and that's the normal way. It has an inherent weakness that somebody knows about and they can exploit it, or you can run it to exhaustion. Your question about quantum computing, if we tried to run modern, sophisticated encryption to exhaustion today, it'd take 1 billion years. With quantum computing, it would just take a few seconds.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Yeah?
Hi, my name's Nicole DeCario. What is the tipping point then? You said that we haven't quite gotten to the pain point yet. What do you envision that tipping point to be where we will build the vault?
Well, I've spent some time thinking about this, and if I ask this audience the question, is the Federal Reserve a good thing? Most people would generally agree. If we need the Federal Reserve, it's a good thing. If I ask, is Social Security a good thing? Most people would agree, and both the parties would argue in maintaining Social Security. So the whole series of events in our history only happened in crisis. You had to have something to force us to deal with it, because we're a nation of special interest, and if we don't want to spend money, our competitors not spending, and we want to give up something. So in my view, it's going to take some forcing function like a crisis. And if you think about many of our engagements, World War I, World War II, there's always some dramatic thing that galvanizes us to action. So is it going to be a series of targets? Is it going to be loss of our competitiveness? I don't know. But I would hope informed debate will get us there. But as I said, last year, 14 bills and amendments, they all failed. 2 this year that aren't likely to pass. So unless the U.S. population the citizens, demand it of their representatives. It will not happen until we have that crisis.
Yeah, I think we've got to have a ray of optimism throughout this because, that we do have banks, and even though bank wrappers got a lot more sophisticated over time, and even though the money system moved electronically, society, if you look, we are making a lot of advances in technology. We are finding fewer vulnerabilities today than there were in the past. People are getting smarter and smarter about this. I mean, we don't have the full legal systems. We don't have the full resources. I don't know that the Denver mayor analogy in crime is exactly right, because he probably wouldn't have the government of Iran coming down on him. So there are complex intergovernmental issues. And so the question, I think, is a good one, which is, will it take a crisis to resolve this? If we'd held a terrorism one, in August of 2001, I don't know what kind of attendance we would have had. So if you go back and kind of say what kind of crisis, will we need a crisis, or are we increasingly aware of the problem? Are we increasingly aware of the lapses in the legal system, in the international system, and in the advances we have to make in technology? I'd say, yeah, there is a growing awareness of all these problems. And so can we get constructive action on it? It's going to take a mobilization to that constructive action, and also finding the right framework. These are tough problems, because our government engages in a lot of practices that we don't want to see happen. I mean, from our point of view, we need to be neutral to our customers. We need to create security, privacy, and we just opened a transparency center so that governments can come look at our source code and be assured that there's nothing in Microsoft source code. We need more companies to open those kinds of centers and to adopt those kinds of practices.
Shane, no one's mentioned or asked about social media, and that's the thing that's exploded, tremendously in the last couple of years. I haven't vetted this statement yet, but someone reported to me the other day, a researcher was looking at it. 80% of the attack vectors in the last year were coming through social media. And social media is the one that's exploding more than any other. So there's another dimension to this that we'll have to deal with as we go along.
Okay, I want to thank you all for your end. The score is still 0-0, I assume, in the game. Okay. Thank you, Mike McConnell, Melody Hildebrandt, Mark Penn.